So I'm going to give you a introduction to the excavations that we're currently carrying out on the Malting complex at Sedgeford. So to give those people who don't necessarily know where Sedgeford is a bit of a head start, this is the map of the UK. I've plotted a few sort of key sites that people might have heard of. The village of Sedgeford is located to the north of Norfolk. And the actual excavation, the site we're working on, is across the river in this area here. Now, the modern village itself is actually located the other side of the river along this road here, and the parish church is here. So there's at some point there's been a shift in where the village is located. Now, the project of the Sedgeford Historical and Archaeological Research Project is focusing on researching the whole history of the village from prehistory all the way up to the modern day. But a lot of the work we're going to talk about today is focusing on the Middle Saxon period. Now, the main reasons we came to this site in 1996 was to investigate the cemetery that was present. And here we looked at over 400 graves. These graves tended to be inhumations and with no grave goods whatsoever. They did have shroud pins and coffin fitments, so we're fairly certain that this is a Middle Saxon Christian cemetery of that sort of period. So once we've finished excavating the cemetery, we actually moved up the hill to start investigating the settlement site. And like most Anglo-Saxon settlements, the excavations revealed things like pits and ditches and a few beam slot buildings and post hole buildings. And it all seemed to be located around this large de-enclosure with a large ditch feature. And this is a sort of reconstruction we've got of the village to show the thing. And as we've got examples of both beam slot buildings and post hole buildings on the site, as well as a trackway that leads off up the hill. Now, how did we find the Malting site? Well, actually, the Malting site was found because we were looking for a metalworking site. So I'm a trained metallurgist, and I came and visited the Sedgeford, and we got talking about the fact that they've got iron slag on the site, as well as ironwork. And we started talking about the fact that we wanted to see if we could find that metalworking site where they were producing the iron. I looked at the geophysics, and you can see on the geophysics the big de-enclosure here and the settlement associated with it. But what I was really interested in was these big features, these big hot spots at the top of the hill. And they looked really promising in terms of a heated or something that had been heated or subjected to heat. So these were really, really promising signs. So we started an excavation in 2013 and we started digging. But initially we didn't find anything. So I got an email from when I was at work. So I was going, we've gone a metre down. We've not found anything at this stage. So they sort of said, oh, it's okay, we'll carry on going down. So they went down another half a metre or so, and they finally hit on the first kiln, kiln 1. Now, the reason we seem to have a really, really deep stratigraphy in this area compared with the settlement site, which is really rather shallow, is because this entire site seems to be in a dip of a valley and in sort of a gully. So I think what we're seeing is actually a buildup of colluvium and on top of all the features in this site. But this has been really good for us because it's actually preserved the site remarkably well. And this is probably one of the reasons why these sorts of sites haven't been spotted before. So in the first few years of excavating, we found a variety of different features. Obviously, we found kiln 1. We found associated floors. So you've got kiln 1 that's here, if you can see my mouse point, an associated floor to the south of it. We also found kiln 2, and that's located where the lady in purple's working, and another clay floor associated with that. So we found a series of these kilns and a series of floors. We also found a large clay-lined pit, and in the bottom of this clay-lined pit, we actually found some wattle and daub in situ as well. It was like upright and hadn't been disturbed at all. And again, this was a really exciting find for us. We also found a big drainage ditch on one side, and a lot, and I mean an absolute tons and tons of burnt grain. So we knew that this had to do something to do with grains, and sort of grain processing. But yeah, with the amounts that we found were quite astonishing. So one of the things we were doing was the problem we had was the fact that we were working in small trenches across the site. And in the end, what we decided was we really needed to understand the relationship between all these different features. So we opened up the whole trench. And this is what became Trench 23. And this was primarily to investigate the different relationships between these features. And over the years, our interpretations changed and varied as it does in archaeology. It went from everything from a very, very, very large bread oven to potentially something to do with grain drying. And we even did toy with, at that stage, the idea of it being a malting facility. But it wasn't until 2018 when the director, Neil Faulkner, actually visited a historic malting house that he realised that we had some of the features that they had in their malting house, and we actually had them on the site. And it started to explain the different features and how they were related in a much more sensible way. So the three main steps you need for malting is you need a steeping tank, you need a germinating floor, and you need a drying kiln. And we had examples of all of those different aspects on our site. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to actually take you through what our most complete example, which is Malt House 1. And this is the sort of schematic of the building that I'm going to take you through. So the first thing you need for malting is you need a steeping tank. Now, this sort of kick-starts the process in the grains, and it starts the germinating process. And basically, the evidence we have for this steeping tank is this big clay-lined pit. And the fact that it's clay-lined means it actually holds water. And even now, when it rains, that feature fills up with water. So you need a sort of clay-lined facility to be able to soak your grains. We also had these in situ wattle and daub walls. So on this side here, you can see quite clearly the wattle frame, and it was covered in a daub layer. And we also have on the other side a potential another wattle and daub in situ wall, and we suspect it probably went the entire across the entire space here, and probably was slightly raised above the floor on this side. Now, the way we think this was used was rather than somebody getting into the tank and disturbing that clay layer and mixing the clay with the grain, we think that it was probably, the grain was probably suspended in a cloth. And this cloth would have been brought down into the water, left in the water for a period, and then brought up and allowed to drain. And using a cloth would make it much easier to get the grain in and out without disturbing the clay floor. And one of the things we have in the site, and particularly in the pit with all the debris from the building, is we have this wonderful iron hook here. And we suspect this was probably hung somewhere on the beams above to hang up your sack of grain. So we seem to have all the evidence to suggest that we've got this sort of process going on in this pit. Now, the next thing you need a germinating floor. Now, this is used to basically lay out your grain to allow them to start this germinating process. And this germinating process will allow the sugars to develop that you need for the malting process. And our main evidence for this is this really large clay surface that we seem to have that extends from the pit here all the way to the kiln. And also the fact that we had an awful lot of grain associated with both the clay layer, but also around. So this works in a very similar way to modern sort of malting complexes. Basically, what you would do is you take your grain from your sack, you put it into a pile, and as the germinating process continues and as the temperatures need to be adjusted, you spread your grain out along the floor. And this is an example of a modern malting house that used some the old same historic techniques for malting some of their grains. And you can see that they've spread the layer of grain across the floor of a room. And this is how we probably would expect to see our malting complex with spread grain from the tank. The really nice thing about the floor is actually it's large enough to spread one load quite thin, but actually we suspect it probably is large enough to have more than one batch at a time. And this is good in terms of timings because the tank tends to take a longer process than actually the spreading on the floor. So, so we think that we're probably looking at multiple batches on the same floor here. So the next thing you need is you need a kiln to dry the malt. And basically this stops the germinating process. If you left your grains damp, they would continue to turn into a plant. You don't want that. You want to stop the process. So you have to dry the grain to do that. So obviously our main evidence for this is we have this kiln structure here, and the kiln is interesting in itself because we have the outside the kiln, but this kiln one is very odd because it's got this inner band of clay, and we're still debating as to whether or not that was a deliberate part of the kiln and how it was working, or whether or not it's actually just some sort of collapse from the top. So we're still debating that. But the other thing we found again lots and lots of burnt grain. Now, we don't think that the grain itself went into the kiln. The reason for this is because the heat of the fire and the fact that you can't control the fire in the kiln would mean you would likely burn your grain more often than dry it. So what we think is the grain probably went on a raised floor above the kiln itself. And what this would do is the kiln would act like a radiator, and it would suck the cold air from the outside and heat it up, and then that hot air would rise through the grain and then out through an opening at the top of the building. And this would continually heat the grain and dry the grain. And one of the really nice bits of evidence to suggest that we have this raised floor above with the grain on it is actually behind the kiln, nowhere near any of the stoking areas, we have a large deposit of burnt grain. And I think this has probably occurred because what's happened when the building burns down, whatever grain has been left on the raised floor above has fallen on top of the kiln and then fallen behind the kiln. So I think this is really good evidence this grain is not in the kiln, it's actually on top and it's fallen off and fallen behind the kiln. So it's really good evidence to suggest we have this raised floor. The other thing we have in terms of evidence for the actual structure of the building is obviously post holes. Now, there'll be a load of people in the audience from the excavation who will be chuckling away because we've got an in-joke about post holes on site. However, we do have enough post holes to suggest we have a fairly decent building. We can sort of plot some of the post holes here and gives us an idea. Now, we don't quite know what's happening around this end of the building. There's a post hole that seems to be in completely the wrong place, quite normal. And we're missing post holes around here. I suspect it was probably a more regular shaped building. We just haven't found them yet. But from this, we can start to get ideas about the building, about the structure itself. And what is really interesting is the post holes around the kiln area tend to be a little bit bigger than the ones at the back of the building here, which suggests potentially this raised floor above. So we've got a difference in height, maybe. And this is the reconstruction we've had done. It gives us an idea of what the building might have looked like when in use. So it gives you that idea of a raised second floor with the grey drying, and you've got your germinating floor and steeping tank over here. As well as the sort of building structure for Malt House 1, we also have ditches. Now we have two ditches. We have one on the east side and we have one on the west side. And these ditches are quite nice because they actually tell a bit of a story in themselves. There seems to be multiple burn phases, or potentially multiple burn phases represented in these ditches. So that might be indicating that we've got potential multiple burning episodes. But these ditches are acting as two things. First of all, they're acting as protection for the site. Because it's located in a gully, the water runs off and will potentially flood your construction. And even during the excavation, any water from the hills, from the field, will flow into the trench. So these are acting as defense, but the other thing is they can also act as water supply for the actual steeping tank. So you need to be able to replenish the water in the tank and empty it out and clean it from time to time. So you probably have access here to potentially a way of draining it, or potentially if there's running water in that ditch, using that water to fill your tank. So as well as Malthouse 1, which is our most complete example, we have potentially more than one malthouse on site. We have kiln 2, which possibly represents the start of Malthouse 2. And this kiln is much bigger and much better, and a more conventional type of kiln. You've got an open box where you put your fire, and you've got a daub outside. This one is also potentially made out of reused daub, so it potentially suggests that we're using daub from somewhere else to make this kiln. Next to it, we have on this side, we have a clay floor again, and it can be quite thick in areas as well. So we have the two main features. They are in a different orientation from Malthouse 1. They seem to have rotated 90 degrees. And we've also started to, last season, pick out the post holes associated with that building. The only thing we don't have yet is we don't have a steeping tank. But like most archaeology, it's probably underneath the bulk. So we'll have a debate in the future as to whether or not we decide to excavate and try and find the steeping tank. We also have another malthouse. We have the start of kiln 3 being excavated here. And again, we've got an associated clay floor. Some of it seems to be underneath a lot of daub rubble. And this was the main focus of excavations last season. And although we are doing this very, very slowly, because one of the things we've been doing is we've been gridding the area, and we've been taking samples, environmental samples, to try and investigate the grains on the site. So we're doing this much more slowly to be able to get that environmental data to help us in terms of identifying different areas of germinating and different types of grains. Again, this is a different orientation, so it suggests that they're changing and then modifying where they're locating their malthouses within the gully. As the gully widens, they're potentially taking advantage of that. And that's not it, because we seem to have other features that are popping up. So we have what is potentially kiln 4, which we found last season. You can just about see the red daub here. I've highlighted it there. And this kiln is much bigger. It's almost double the size of kiln 2. So if it is a kiln, it's absolutely massive. We're still investigating this one. And the last week of the last season we also started to get some more daub material popping up here. So the suggestion is maybe this is another kiln. And actually, if you look at the geophysics, we've got kiln 1, 2, and 3. There's these two blobs 4 and 5 that we haven't yet found or explained. So we're potentially looking at maybe 4 or 5 kiln structures on this site. We also have more clay floors. These don't yet seem to be associated with any of those kilns. However, they do seem to have associated post holes, but each floor has a slightly different makeup to it. So this clay floor here has a very, very yellow clay compared to the other clay floor for kiln 1, and is also different from this clay floor here, which is much more grey colour and has also got ash and things like that associated with it. This clay floor also seems to have a ramp, which we can't quite explain yet, whether or not it's just to do with the sinking of the soil or whether or not it was actually a ramp. We're still debating, but there's obviously an awful lot of different features on this site that we need to try and to investigate and look at. Now, in terms of phasing the sites, we're often asked which one came first, and can we say anything about the phasing? Well, unfortunately, we've kiln Malthouse 1, 2, and 3. They don't seem to directly overlap, so we can't be sure which ones came first. Obviously, in kiln 2, we have the suggestion of reused daub that's actually included in the makeup of it. And if you do mess around with some of the post holes and alignments, you can potentially suggest that rather than that kind of alignment, we've got this kind of alignment with the post holes. So there might be a suggestion that actually there is some overlap in terms of the structures. But again, I think we need to find more of the post holes to be able to absolutely certain as to where these alignments are. The other thing in terms of phasing that we tend to have further on the southern area of the site down here, is we have these layers of clay, these clay surfaces, and these do occasionally seem to be sealing each other. So again, we might get some more tight phasing further up the hill compared with this area where there's a lot more, everything's a lot more spread out. The big issue though is obviously at this stage we only have this one steeping tank. So there is a possibility that they were reusing this steeping tank, even if this malt house had gone out of use, malt house wouldn't have gone out of use, they may have still retained and kept that steeping tank. But it could also be we just haven't found the other steeping tanks associated with malt house 2 and malt house 3. So we've still got a bit of investigation to see whether or not we've got more than one steeping tank. So in conclusion, the malting complex we've got has at least 3 malt houses and potentially more. So we're finding more kilns as we go on. And that we don't at this stage have a really good grasp on whether or not they're all happening at the same time, as i.e. it's an entire complex and they're doing multiple things at one time, or in my mind that it's multiple phases. So they're basically as one malt house goes out of use and burns down, they build the next one and they keep using, and therefore it's used over a longer period, but for smaller batches. Obviously, we have these drainage ditches, which suggest that we've got some kind of managed landscape. So they're looking at how the landscape and how the buildings fit into the landscape. And one of the things we don't seem to have at the moment is we don't have the remains of any grain storage areas. But this could be for 2 reasons. Either it's not in our excavated area, or it could be that they're storing the grain in the village and they're just bringing up the grain when they need to use it. But what this whole excavation is definitely showing is that the production, the amount of material that they're processing and producing is much more than just a general cottage industry. It's not a village-based project. It seems to be a much bigger project that they're working on here at Sedgeford. Okay, well, I will leave you with a quick drone flyover of the site and ask if there's any questions.